From the classroom to the wilderness, my guest built a life around exploring the connections between science, art, and education. Welcome to this episode of I Love Your Stories. I'm your host, Hava Gurvich, and my guest today is Rosalind Philips, a teacher, scientist, software engineer, and accomplished nature photographer. Rosalind has spent her life exploring the connections between art, science, and education. In this episode, she opens up about her early influences, her career as an educator and software engineer, and her passion for nature and wildlife. We talk about her journey as a photographer with 3 decades of selling art at art fairs, the lessons learned along the way, and how she's navigated both triumphs and challenges as a woman of color in the arts. She also shares her hands on approach to teaching, rooted in the belief that knowledge isn't isolated, but deeply interconnected, and her lifelong commitment to public service and genuine human connection. Rosalind, welcome to the podcast. Now, quick word from our sponsor, and then we'll get right back to the show. When I started selling my art, I had absolutely no idea how to actually turn it into a business, a professional business. And then I came across art storefronts, and that was a game changer. I've been a customer now for years, and they've been instrumental every step of the way of helping me succeed. I have a gorgeous, powerful commerce website. I have marketing tools and a membership to a community that is very supportive and teaches me how to succeed as an artist. Check them out, artstorefronts.com, and tell them Hala sent you. Welcome back to the podcast. My guest today is wildlife photographer Rosalind Philips. Rosalind, it's a pleasure having you on the podcast. And, tell everyone about a little bit about your background and how you got into photography.
I would be happy. Hava, I am so delighted to be here. I have really enjoyed participating in the Breakfast Club. In fact, sometimes I think that's the most valuable one of all the education that Art Storefronts does because it's a heartfelt conversation among artists. And yes, we talk about the business stuff, but we also talk about the soul side of it.
Mhm.
And to be honest, that's why we're artists.
Absolutely.
Our souls. It feeds our hearts.
Yes. And that's kind of what I want this podcast to become is a sort of an extension, a public extension of that.
No, but what you do, I think, is why joining the platform is valuable. I mean, there's all the other stuff, but it's the human side
Mm.
to me that makes it worth it. I feel like I get a different type of validation as an artist.
Absolutely.
And to me, that's what's very important. Anyway, I was born in New York City,
Hmm.
and live in way, way upper Manhattan, even above Washington Heights. I lived in a little neighborhood called Inwood, and the Cloisters, which is the medieval part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is right there. And that's an important part of my life. But anyway, I grew up in New York City and in upper Manhattan, there are lots of parks, and it was a very well, like most New York neighborhoods, it was a diverse neighborhood. We actually had a very strong Jewish population there. And then there were lots of black people, and most of the black people were of West Indian descent. And then there were lots of people from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. So it was a very mixed place, you know. And so, it was a nice place. And New York City back in the late 50s developed this thing called the Mitchell-Lama co-ops. And they were these beautiful apartment buildings that get you could buy an apartment for a reasonable price, and it was geared towards middle class families. And so that's where I grew up, in this wonderful building, and so I have two sisters, and we just it was really pretty good. My mom was a school teacher, in the New York City public school system, and so she sent us to private school. We went She worked very hard for that. We went to this wonderful school, called that was run by the Ethical Culture Society, which is as Reform Judaism as you can get, and it was based on John Dewey's laboratory schools, so it was a very action doing. I mean, it's like I can pretty much remember almost every single day of elementary school,
Wow.
you know? And this is all very important to me as a wildlife photographer because everything was based around social studies.
Mm.
So, for example, in fourth grade, we studied the Vikings. So that meant that what we were reading and writing stories about in English were the Norse myths. And what we were learning about in social studies, of course, was the history. But then there was art class. And then we had this wonderful class called Industrial Arts. And in that class, we learned how to cook and sew. And so in fourth grade, we made Viking costumes, and everybody did this, boys and girls, right? And it was wonderful. So you had the art, you had the math, because we learned about whatever math system they had, besides regular fourth grade math and stuff. In third grade, we did Native Americans. In fifth grade, it was the Middle Ages. In sixth grade, it was the colonization of America. So the great Jane Goodall just passed, and she was certainly one of my idols. And one of the highlights of my high school life was the opportunity to take some classes with her.
Wow.
Yeah, and so just very important.
Yeah.
So the other part of it was my mother believed that if you wanted your black children to grow up safe in New York City, you sent them out of the city for the summer.
Mhm.
And so the way she afforded that was was a counselor at this Quaker camp up in Vermont, the Farm and Wilderness Foundation, and we went to camp in Vermont. And that's really, where my love of nature really, really blossomed, and so I did all kinds of stuff like that. Now, my dad was an amateur photographer,
Okay.
and I would say maybe when I was 10, maybe 8, and my sister Brenda was 6, no, 8. So, because there are 2 years between us, we got our first cameras,
Wow.
and they were little point and shoots. And, so we took pictures all the time, and my dad would occasionally give us some instruction. And so taking pictures has just always been a part of my life,
Wow.
and that was pretty remarkable.
As you were talking, what it seems to me, and I don't know yet too much about your current life as a wildlife photographer. I do know you've been doing it for many, many decades, for decades, and that you fell in love with both nature, animals, and photography in your early teens. So you're just living your best life. Like you're living the life that you started living as a child. Would that be
I am now, yes. You know, the first 20 years of my working career, I was a teacher,
oh,
high school and teacher education classes and computer science classes in the local colleges. I moved to Olympia, Washington when I was, I don't know, maybe 24, 25. Because I started my teaching career at a Quaker school just outside of Washington, D.C. And I taught, and as I say, I did my time in middle school.
That's amazing that you valued education so much growing up, and it left such an impression that you decided to go into education as well and impart your knowledge to another generation.
You know, the experience that I had at Fieldston so profoundly affected my life and my sister's lives
Mhm.
that I wanted to share that experience with people who didn't have the the parents that sacrifice so much to send their children to a private school.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we had scholarships and things like that, but still, to send 3 children to private school is pretty difficult,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know? And so I taught math and science
Mhm.
and computers. And so I became a national leader in using the computer in the classroom and worked on several pioneering projects. I built, when I started out teaching, we had the Apple IIe computer. And what was
I
so
remember.
great about that Yeah, what was so great about that computer was that it was really accessible and you could build things and plug them in and use them. So I built a whole thing of lab equipment
Mhm.
so that we could do that. And all my classes have always been project based. So to skip ahead many years, so in the late 80s, early 90s, it was fairly fashionable to bash high school kids, and talk about how horrible they were. And I just got tired of it.
Mm.
So I brought my camera back out because I had actually stopped taking pictures in college. And through that, I got my camera out again and I started um taking pictures of my kids in the classroom and what they were doing because I was just so impressed because again my classes were all project based. Okay. And the school that I was teaching at, a public school, was an alternative school.
Wow.
And the school was geared towards kids who didn't fit in, but it was really geared towards low achieving kids who really had amazing potential. And so pretty much my imagination could run wild in my teaching because I could do pretty much anything I wanted. Anyway, I was taking lots and lots of pictures. But, while the kids were doing different things, I started taking pictures of other things and rediscovered my love of photography and birds. And so, although this picture behind me is not the hummingbird picture that I took, back in 1992, but it was a hummingbird picture, a hummingbird nest that was over a stream that I noticed when the kids were doing water samples, and so I took a picture of a hummingbird sitting on her nest, and that was kinda like the start of everything again.
Wow, I love that. So there is an actual pivotal photograph that you took that
Mhm,
reignited your entire passion.
mhm,
That's amazing. So
mhm.
where did it go from there?
Well, it meant that I went it meant that I got a real camera because remember in those days, we're still shooting film,
Yes.
and the primary science classes that I taught were physics and chemistry and advanced biology, so genetics and things like that. And so, photography is physics. I mean, it's a study of light. So I took my love of physics and I put it into my photography and I started studying. And, I have been keeping nature journals like this probably since I was about, I don't know, maybe 12, 13. So I had a really big sketchbook at that time. And what I would do is when I would take my pictures, because on film, I would then paste them into my big sketchbook and I would write down, the settings and, which you had to write down
Yes.
meticulously as you
Yeah, yeah.
took each picture because we didn't have it automatically then. And then I would write down what I liked or didn't like about the picture. And from there, I started to develop my philosophy of photography.
I'd love to
It-
hear what that philosophy is.
well, the philosophy is that there's a reason why we take a picture.
Mhm.
And there's a reason and that there's a difference between a photograph and a snapshot,
Absolutely. Yeah.
right? I mean, a snapshot is you just take pictures. A photograph, though, you think about it and there's planning.
Yeah. So it's about
right?
intent.
It's a bad intent.
Yeah.
And so it very quickly changed from just writing down my settings to what's the story?
Mhm.
Why did I want to press the shutter? What was the intent?
Mhm. What would you say is, the kind of narrative, like the overarching narrative of your photography story? What is the main story that you are trying to tell?
So if you were to read, the stuff on the website, it would talk about how my intent with doing birds, because that really is my first love of wildlife is birds. Not that I don't do lots of other things, and I'll talk about that later, but um is I want you to really see the story. I want you to see the soul of that living creature. I want you to know that every single living creature, whether it be a bird or an insect, is worthy and deserves the same respect that we give other human beings. And that's what I want to convey through my photography.
Love
I
that.
want to convey
Mm.
that story. I want to convey that. The Quakers, because the camps that we went to, the Foreman Wilderness Camp, were started by a Quaker couple.
Mhm.
The Quakers have a saying of that of God within every person, and every child deserves to be loved. And so that was my philosophy as a teacher. That is my philosophy for life.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you can just extend that. Every living creature, whether it be an animal or a tree or a flower or a mushroom,
Mm.
deserves to be loved. And that's my,
Yep.
that's my that's my philosophy. Yeah, that has governed my entire life.
Yeah. Let me
So
let me ask you a question. Um, right now, what are you most passionate about right now?
right now, astrophotography.
Oh.
Um, it's really funny because I've been looking at my pictures and I realized that I really haven't taken very many bird pictures this summer. I haven't really taken very many animal pictures since I got back from Alaska in early June.
Fell in love with the sky.
Well, I've always been in love with taking pictures of the Milky Way.
Mm.
In 1997, I got ill. And it was really kind of ironic because for the first time in my life, I had a safe science lab, that had ventilation and stuff. And I got really, really sick. And at the end of 1997, actually got carted out of the school on a stretcher
Wow.
because I had such a bad asthma attack and I had developed chemical sensitivities, which I didn't realize, and I got carted out of my classroom on a stretcher, and I never went back to teaching.
Mm.
And that was a really hard transition for me to make, and I went into my next great love, which was software engineering, because I'd always been very active with technology. And so I then spent the rest of my working career as a software engineer and worked for the Washington State Department of Health as their lead software engineer
Mm.
and was responsible for the software that collected all the infectious disease data around the state and sent it off to CDC every week.
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
Um, so, obviously, I didn't know anything about you when we started talking, and so I introduced you as, like, wildlife photographer, that's all I knew. But you
I am as
had
a teacher. Really what I am as a
a
teacher
teacher
because
and a scientist and, an engineer and all of these other things. I'm curious, like, um, where w I mean, your photography is not just a hobby,
oh, no, 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 no. It's my soul.
it's your soul.
It's my soul, and so one of the things that stopping teaching did, it meant that, even though I didn't have those 8 weeks in the summer to pursue photography, it meant though that I could do things at different times of the year and I could really pretty much be in charge of my own schedule.
Okay.
But I would say that my life as a professional photographer really started in 1995.
Okay. And
Okay.
for you, life as a professional photographer means, because I know you sell a lot of your photography. Is that your main
In art, in the art,
art
yeah,
fairs?
the summer art circuit
Mhm. How and you've been doing that for a long time.
since
Uh,
1990, since 1996. Yeah, I'm
can
mounting
you
stuff.
can you talk a little bit about that lifestyle as an artist who has made a career doing the art fair circuit? Because that's something that I know, some of us are really curious about, and it has to be a lifestyle. Can you talk a little bit about like the pros and cons of that?
Sure. You know, um, the nice thing was that Olympia, Washington really has a very vibrant arts community. And so in 1996, Olympia started this little thing that was called art. I guess really it was art on the landing because we have this beautiful waterfront, because Olympia is right on Puget Sound.
Yeah.
And you could sign up for these Sunday afternoons. And so, you know, built some pegboard stands. At that time, I didn't even have a tent. And there were two jewelry artists, my friends Heather and Todd, that were starting doing this at the same time. And we kind of grew together
Mm.
as artists and started learning, and because I am a scientist, I'm very methodical in looking up how to do things. And you have to remember that in those days, back in the mid 90s, the internet is not really a big thing yet.
No, that's about it.
And so I'm in the library doing research
Mhm.
about how to do this. I think at that time I didn't know about the Small Business Administration and that I could take
Mhm.
classes with them. And so I just figured it out. And, so, all the amazing tools that we have now to get started, none of that stuff existed. I
Yeah.
just figured it out.
You're such a scientist and an engineer. And you talk a lot about the methodology of it. I wanna talk more about emotion. How, like, from your first time sort of setting up and having your art on display for people to buy, I I'd love to hear, like, what did it feel like, to have to sell your first photograph, to get your first, like, repeat client? Um, how what was that like?
Probably the most important thing for me during those first years was learning that selling and how much you sold was not the measure of your success.
I'm
Because
glad you
what
said
you have to realize is that I was always used to being the best,
that.
the top of my feet, as a student, as a teacher, you know. And so you're sitting there in that booth, this, and
Mhm.
people come by and they look at it and they say, very nice, and then they leave.
Yeah.
Well, very nice is
Doesn't pay the
nice, but it
bills.
doesn't give you money to buy more camera equipment.
Right.
I mean, because you have to realize that at this time when I started, I'm still a full-time teacher.
Okay.
Okay. And so I don't need the money from the booth to pay my mortgage. What I need the money for is to be a photographer and to be able to travel and to be able to buy new equipment and to buy more photography books. And most importantly, because remember, we're still in film days, to process my film.
Yeah.
When I made my first sale to somebody who wasn't a friend or family, it was
Mhm.
a pretty big deal. I was over the moon.
you're so right to say that, selling your art is not the same thing as being good as an artist, and that should not be a metric of validation. On the other hand, there's still that, like, that feeling when somebody who doesn't know you isn't, like, kissing up to you or anything like that. They genuinely love your art so much that they're parting with their hard-earned money so that they can own it, and that is just an amazing feeling, isn't it?
Really is. And so my philosophy in my booth was to always have a wide range of prices
Mhm.
because I believed that everybody deserved to have beautiful artwork in their homes. And so I had my cards and I had, prints, matted prints, and I had the frame stuff, on the wall.
Yeah.
And what I very rapidly discovered through doing Harbor Days, which is the Labor Day celebration here in Olympia.
Mhm.
And so when I started doing that show, and the first time I would have done that would have been in 1996, what I very rapidly discovered was that people would buy a card, and then the next year they'd come back and they'd buy a print. And then the next year they'd come back and they'd buy the framed picture. And so what I discovered very quickly was that the same types of relationships that I built with my students over the years, I needed to build with my clients. And so that's what I focused on.
I love that.
And I would even sometimes, particularly people who had kids, I would actually make notes about people because I would
Course you
see
did.
them year after year.
Yeah.
And I would see them at Harbor Days and I'd see them at Art Walk, our local types of things. I would see them at the holiday shows.
Mm.
And so over that time, I would build these amazing relationships with people,
Amazing.
you know, and today, when I do Harbor Days, I have people who were little kids
Yes.
who are now bringing their grandchildren to see my stuff and telling stories to their grandchildren about me
Yeah.
when they were children, you know?
Yeah.
So, one of the nice things about doing art in your community, and also because I was a teacher in the community, is that I just have all these relationships and I
Mm.
treasure those relationships. When people
Yeah.
come we hug, we ask each other how your year has been. They
Yes.
ask me where I've traveled and do I have anything special that I want to show them.
That's fantastic. This actually dovetails very nicely to a question I like to ask all my guests. How would you define success now, and how has it changed over time?
Ooh, that's a really good one. Well, I've certainly selling lots of stuff is always good,
Yeah.
but I really think that I define my success by repeat customers and the relationships that I've built with them over time, you know. Um,
And especially because your art has a very specific message that you are sharing through your work. And so when it resonates with others, and especially over time, it it really does feel like advocacy to some degree, doesn't it?
it is advocacy for building a relationship with nature.
Yeah.
And so over time, when I first started taking pictures, it was mostly about portraits, animal portraits, and just trying to get it in focus, have a nice blurry back. It was about that. But over time, it has very much changed into giving a window onto nature's
Mhm.
life.
Yeah.
to their interactions. So if I just duck my head out of the way, this is more of the type of picture I take today
Mhm.
with mom feeding the chicks,
Mhm.
you know? And so this particular picture represents, well, the whole range of pictures represents um 21 days, well, more than 21 days of pictures because there's a wildlife refuge not too far, and every year the rufous hummingbirds pretty much nest in the same area. They don't use the same nest.
Yeah.
And, and we're all looking for the nest. And as
Yeah.
soon as somebody finds the nest, they let everybody know. And then I start staking out the nest.
Yeah.
And depending on where the nest is located, I figure out the time of day I want to be there.
So for those of us listeners who are not watching it on YouTube and can't see the photo, what we're looking at is a close up of a hummingbird's nest, and the nest itself is made out of lichen
L- Lichen and spider webs.
and spider webs. And this beautiful little bird has two chicks, and she is in the process of feeding one of the chicks. It's just such an intimate and magical moment, especially because it's a hummingbird, so it's so tiny, and seeing this delicate creature, in such detail is actually quite amazing. Um,
Right. And it tells a very, very vivid story.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so we talked about your success. This what success means is, connecting with people and building those connections over time, and generational connections with people. Um, what are some of the challenges that you've encountered in your career as an artist?
Right. There are a number of challenges. First off, there's the challenge itself of your booth doing outdoor shows
Yeah.
and coming up with an arrangement that lasts through windstorms and rainstorms
Mhm.
and still looks beautiful,
Mhm.
because it has to look beautiful.
Yeah.
And so obviously my booth has changed over the years to do that. One of my worst show stories is um rain was forecast for one evening. It was a summer show up in Seattle. And I sort of looked at it and I thought, I think I'm going to take all the pictures off the wall and put them in their tubs and cover up the tubs with a tarp. And I don't, because I just looked at it, it was supposed to be windy. And, I had that grid wall, so the booth wasn't going anywhere. It, you know?
Mhm.
And so that morning when I got back, it was like, well, where's my tent? And it had collapsed.
Oh.
And the middle was down on the ground, and then the edges were still up around the grid wall. But if I had had my pictures up on the wall, they all would have been ruined. Some people's tents were gone. Um, Everybody's tent pretty much was ruined. And in those days, Costco was so great because you just took it back in and they gave you another one. It was great. But that was, but that, but that
Yeah.
was, that's the type of thing you deal with.
Mhm.
The other thing that I dealt with, besides practicalities of money and all that, and insurance and all that kind of stuff, was the fact that unfortunately racism is alive and well in America. And that really has not changed. And people have stereotypical images of what women, and particularly what Black women, women of color, can do.
Mhm.
And so, it still is not uncommon for somebody. I mean, in 2025, it still is not uncommon for somebody to come into my booth and say, "Is this your husband's work?" And to assume that I'm married to a white man. And I have got into some essentially, I just ask people to leave my booth. It's because engaging in conversation just upsets me.
Yeah.
And it
And you
makes
shouldn't have to.
give off the right kind of energy.
Yeah. Which makes it even more remarkable that you are committed to your passion and have persevered over 3 decades. Um,
Well, that's because I believe that even though there are hateful people in this world, I still believe
yeah,
that the majority of people have their hearts in the right places. And those are most of the people that I interact with.
yeah.
You know?
And you've interacted with, like, 3 generations of people. The
Mhm.
kids, the little kids now have grandkids. And, so, you can clearly say that your message, and each one of those people shares that story with, their people, and I feel like the message that you're sharing, is, worth sharing, and, I think it trumps
Mhm.
the few, um I have a lot of respect for anyone who continues to, do their passion, and it's like we said from the beginning, a passion for wildlife, for animals, for the environment, for ecology, for storytelling, for, arts and photography, all of that. You've had that in you since you were 10 years old, and you have known from a very young age how important it is to have an education, and you've watched your mom, and your dad, do everything they can to, give you the best start in life. Um, and I think, if I was to say, like, what is the definition of success? I mean, you wake up every morning, and I know there's challenges. There's always challenges. There's life challenges. As we get older, there's health challenges and so on. But you get to do what what you were meant to do in this life.
Yes. And now that I'm retired, I can really, really focus on stuff,
Yeah.
and so the 2 things I love to do is take pictures and teach. And so I teach photography, in
Oh,
fact,
that's
over
great.
Zoom. And so one of the things I love about being an artist and a teacher is that I am always learning new things and finding new ways to look at stuff.
Mm,
So if you were to look at some of my newest work, you would see that over the years, I've started doing a lot more abstract stuff with nature because what I have found is that by doing some abstract stuff, I'm really getting into the soul of stuff. So
mm,
here's a story for you. I went out to the coast to do Milky Way pictures on this beautiful place called Ruby Beach, which is on like the wild Washington North coast. But there's also the whole rainforest up
mm,
there. And so whenever I'm in that area, I always, now the whole rainforest is like going into a mystical fairyland. It is just this most amazing place. And for 30 years, I have taken pictures of the whole rainforest, and I have never printed one
mm,
because it has never done what I wanted it to do. And so this particular day, I said, I think I'm going to just leave my big lens in my pack, and I'm just going to use my mid-range lens, and I'm going to do what's called intentional camera movement. I'm going to have a long exposure and move my camera around and see if that does more of what I feel in my heart. And so what I ended up doing was doing one kind of like this up and down of this group of cedar trees with all the big moss hanging down and stuff. And it did it. It captured it. It did exactly what I wanted. And I split it up into a triptych. And when people look at that picture, they look at me and they say, "Oh my God, this is the whole." This is what I feel in my heart.
Wow.
You know,
That
another picture that I did that day was I laid on my back and I looked up at the canopy and I zoomed my lens in and out. And when I looked at the picture, I could see a woman dancing.
it's amazing.
That's,
Mother
and for
Nature.
me, what I immediately thought of was Langston Hughes.
Mm.
Music is a very, very important part of my life. My mother was a pianist. We all learned, she was a music teacher. We all learned how to play instruments. And I looked up at that and I heard Langston Hughes's poem, A Dream Deferred, to fling my arms wide in the face of the sun, to dance, dance, dance till the dark day is done.
About that.
Okay. And then Sweet Honey in the Rock, which is this incredible a cappella Black women's group, put it to music. And so when I looked at that, I immediately heard them singing it. And my mother and I did a fair amount of travel during the latter part of her life after she retired from teaching. And whenever we would go someplace, and particularly in a waterfall, she would fling her arms wide and twirl around and say, "Rosalind, take a picture of me."
Oh my
And
God.
so I have all these pictures. And so when I look at that picture, I see all of that stuff. Again, it captures a soul.
That's
And it's part of my Juneteenth collection because every year I pick a picture that I've taken over the last year and I designate it as the Juneteenth picture that tells the story.
so just as a final thing, how can people find you? Where can they find you both physically and virtually?
So physically, I live in Olympia, Washington,
And they can
and
find you at the different art fairs there, right?
they
So,
can find me at different. You're right. So my next big show is my big Christmas show, The Best of the Northwest in Seattle,
okay.
which would be November 7th, 8th, and 9th up in Seattle.
All right.
And I actually will be featuring some of my night photography as well as my pictures from Alaska when I went up to Alaska and spent an amazing 2 weeks up there in June. My website is rosalindphillipsphotography.com. And of course, I'm on Facebook and Instagram, and you can just type in Rosalind Phillips Photography.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Um, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Hava.
Thanks again for tuning in. That's our episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please help us out by leaving a review, a comment, subscribing, sharing it with your friends. Every little bit helps, and I really appreciate it. And before we go, I want to give a huge shout out to our sponsor and producer, Art Storefronts. If you've been thinking about turning your art into a real business or just want to level up your online presence, now is honestly the best time, especially with the holiday selling season coming up in Q4. I can't stress this enough. Art Storefronts isn't just a website builder. They're a full-blown partner for your art business. They give you the tools, education, and marketing support to actually make sales, not just sit online and hope. And if you're unsure whether your art will sell, no worries. Just head to artstorefronts.com and sign up for a demo. They'll give you a free art review and a marketing assessment of your art to show you exactly what's possible. So go to artstorefronts.com, tell them Hava sent you, and I'll catch you on the next episode.